Hi friends, Father Kerry Walters here, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church, and this is another Holy Spirit moment, this one on practicing stability like a monk, not like an American. In previous videos, we have examined how to read the Bible like a monk and how to obey like a monk. We are inspired by the rule of Saint Benedict, that wonderful guidebook for attaining a rich and meaningful and purposeful spiritual life in our journeys toward God. Today we will be looking at stability, which is one of the three vows that a Benedictine monk or nun take. Obedience, stability, and conversion of life. We'll be looking at conversion of life in a future video. But for now, practicing stability like a monk. On the American scene, whenever we use the word stability, the first thing that pops into most of our minds is financial stability, isn't it? Financial stability is a goal or an endpoint for us. It's what we want our lives to wind up in. To be financially stable is to be without any worries or concerns, either in the present or the future, about money. That's what we all want, to grab that golden ring and to become stable from a financial perspective. Sometimes when we use the word stability, we're talking about social reputation or social celebrityhood. And we can also use the word stability on the American scene from a national perspective, right? When we talk about national stability, which probably means either that things are calm domestically or that the nation has become an international powerhouse. All of these are end goals. But this kind of stability, we pretty easily know from experience, don't we, can frequently erode our characters. To pursue financial stability often means that we have to jettison values that we once held to be important and essential to a good life. A player in the high-stake financial world, for example, can't afford to be compassionate or loving or forgiving. Might need to engage in dirty tricks of the trade in order to shove away competitors or to get an advantage over others. So financial stability as the goal of our life can indeed come at too high a price. You need only think of that wonderful and horrifying movie, Citizen Kane, Orson Welles' Citizen Kane. The lead character in it, Citizen Kane, is a man who has achieved financial stability and social stability. He has an immense fortune and he has a national and international reputation, but he has been hollowed out by his drive to attain those two kinds of stability, and he dies alone and loveless. That's not the kind of stability that monks practice. Stability in the monkish tradition is not an end point. It's a process. It's a means to an end. Listen, all three of the vows that a Benedictine monk takes, obedience, stability, and conversion of life, although good, are not goods in and of themselves. They are good insofar as they direct their practitioners toward God. They are good insofar as they help us achieve a more and more intimate relationship with the Lord. And as a consequence, they at least have that difference with the American understanding of stability as an endpoint, as a stopping point. But of course, they mean something much more than that as well. So what else do they mean? Well, it can't be denied that stability at one level for Benedict and in the entire monkish tradition means remaining in one physical location. Benedict was concerned about the kinds of monks that he calls in the very first chapter of his rule, the gyrophagi. These are monks, he says, who travel restlessly and endlessly from one place to another. They never sink any roots. They never have any foundation. They are like wind-blown leaves, hither and yon. And probably the reason why they are so restless is given by the 20th century monk Thomas Merton, who would argue that a person who belongs to the tribe of gyrophagi is always looking for a perfect monastery, always looking for a perfect convent. They don't seem to realize that the restlessness that they are experiencing comes from their own interior restlessness. It's not the result of the particular house of faith that they happen to reside in. So staying in one place long enough to learn that it can be a refuge and that it can be a spiritual powerhouse is a necessary understanding of Benedictine stability. The literature refers to it as stabilitas loci, the stabilization of location, or the stability of location. True enough. But there is an equally important kind of stability that Benedict is talking about, and that is especially pertinent for the spiritual pilgrimage of those of us who live in the outside world. Stabilitatis cordis, stability of the heart. You and I frequently have restless hearts, don't we? In fact, St. Augustine, in the very first paragraph of his wonderful book, The Confessions, speaks about the restlessness of heart and tells us, as you know, that our hearts are restless until they rest in God. Resting in God is what the Benedictines mean by stabilitatis cordis, the stable heart. You and I are gyrophagi all too frequently when it comes to our religious beliefs, when it comes to our spiritual positions, aren't we? And that's because we allow ourselves to be driven hither and yon by passing desires and passing fads and passing moods. A few years ago, I wrote a book entitled Giving Up God to Find God. And it was a study of 20th century idolatry in the United States. In that particular book, what I tried to do was to examine a number of prevalent idols. And one of them was an idol that I called Designer God. When Americans worship Designer God, they create their own God. They patchwork together a deity. They take a little bit of Christianity, a little bit of Hinduism, a little bit of New Age stuff, a little bit of Buddhism. They smack it all together, and they create a God that will suit their own fancies, their own desires of the moment. As soon as their perspectives begin to change, they'll rip a piece out of that designer God and plug in a substitute piece so that now that God fits what they believe. And when it changes again in the future, as it almost certainly will, they'll do the same thing again and again and again. When our spirituality is fueled by our self-will, when our spirituality is fueled by nothing more than the flotsam and jetsam of our desires, of our fads, of the latest fashion, then we have no stability of heart. We are prone to, subject to, the passing of the ages, just as a piece of driftwood is to the passing of the tide back and forth. What we need to do is to take seriously that Benedictine vow of obedience, that is, attuning the ears of the heart to the will of God. What we need to do is to put aside our own self-will and our own desires long enough to be able to take root in the voice and the will of God in order to stabilize ourselves, so that we're not running hither and yon, so that we're not tasting the religion of the week, the spirituality of the week. We can do this to a certain extent in solitude. Solitude is always going to be important for a person who is on the path to God. But Benedict argues, and I think that he's absolutely right about this, that we also absolutely need to do this in community. Whether that community is a religious house like a monastery or a convent, or whether it is a denomination, a parish, or whether it is a biological family, what we need to do is to recognize that in order to achieve stability of heart, we need to live in community with other people who will help discipline us in stability of heart. When we live with other people, we learn how to love. We learn how to offer compassion. We learn perseverance and we learn patience. What we are not likely to do after we live in community for a certain amount of time is to say, you know what, I'm tired of this. I want to move on. I want to find that more perfect community. or we're not likely to throw up our hands in disgust whenever we hit a rough patch, whenever a member of the community happens to annoy us, or whenever we find ourselves in a spiritual slump, distanced from God. Perseverance in a particular community will strengthen our ability to sustain those kinds of moments and to recognize that far from being obstacles in our journey towards God, they are actually opportunities to cultivate that stability of heart, which is a necessary condition for acquiring a more and more intimate relationship with God. We don't want to be gyrophagy. We want to remain single-hearted, if I can put it that way, in our devotion to the members of the community in which we live, and also in our listening, our attuning ourselves to the will, to the voice of God. Now, make no mistake about it, that will require a certain amount of discipline. In addition to this gyrophagy, Benedict has great disdain, as he again mentions in chapter 1 of the rule, for another group of monks, the Celibates. And the Celibates don't necessarily move from one place to the next, but they have no discipline. They make up their rule as they go, and it changes with their passing whim. They don't take vows seriously. They don't take promises seriously. The vows and the promises can be broken whenever they decide to break them, whenever they find it unpleasant to continue with them. My friends, that's not spiritual discipline. That's spiritual anarchy. What we need to do is to root ourselves firmly in a community and in a tradition. We need to recognize that there are some things in a community or a tradition that are not necessary, that are not essential, but there are other things which are absolutely necessary and absolutely essential that define that tradition and that define that community, and we need to embrace them. It may take a while to do so, but taking the time, persevering, disciplining oneself, being patient with oneself is well worth the effort. Stability of heart, stabilitas cordis, is a necessary condition, at least in the monkish tradition, for growing closer and closer not only to God, but also to one's brothers and sisters, regardless of the community which one finds oneself. And it also is a necessary condition for coming to a deeper and richer self-knowledge. Now remember that I said that stability in the monkish tradition isn't an end goal, isn't a stopping point like financial stability is in the American ethos. Monkish stability is a process. And what that means, my friends, is that it should never become stagnant. Stability doesn't mean unchanging. Stability means a centering, a heart responding to events as they unfold around us. Because we are creatures who change over time, our understanding of what constitutes stability has a certain amount of leeway and flexibility. St. Benedict was quite certain about this in his rule. He recognized that the last thing that we want to do is to identify stability with rigidity that will inframe and imprison the human spirit. And he allowed for that flexibility in the third vow that he invited people to take: conversion of life, conversatio morum, as it's called in the Latin. And that ability to have a dynamic stability fostered by an earnest and intent listening to the will of God, obedience, is what we'll talk about in our next video, about how to do things monkishly and not like an American. Friends, I'm Father Kerry Walters. This has been another Holy Spirit moment. Thank you so very much. If you are of a mind to subscribe, I invite you to do so. All you need to do is to press the button at the bottom of the screen. Take good care. God bless. I will see you again real soon.